Welcome to the KIX EAP Podcast, your monthly podcast with important leaders in education from Eastern Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, and the Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Ryan Allen, assistant professor at Soka University of America here in Orange County, California. My own background is in international and comparative education. Let's start the show. Today we have Amélie Gagnon, a demographer and senior program specialist in the technical cooperation team at UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning, IIEP. We get into so much during this interview, bringing stats into education, advising governments, data decision-making, natural hazards, online education, the open access movement. It was just a lot of fun. Let's get started. Thank you for joining me on the show today. I'm quite excited for this conversation. If we could we talk to you a little bit about your educational background and you do all this wonderful work with data. How did you get into data? But you also sort of connect that to education. So sort of, did the interest with data come first or education, or how did you kind of merge those two together?
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for having me. I'm a demographer, so I guess this is population studies. So it's like a mix of maths and people. There's this French philosopher who used to say it's political arithmetics. And so I think that this kind of phrase really represents what I'm doing. I use maths, I use algorithms, I use data to actually get insights to, inform public policies. And so, I've always loved maths or, logical stuff, but I was always very attracted to people-centric sectors. And so for a while, when I was, in my, early studies at uni, I was thinking of doing business, public relations, economics, political science. But at some point I was like, what would I be improving? What would be my kind of addition to this world? And so that's how I kind of got interested in demography. And through this, I got my first real job at Statistics Canada in my National Statistical Office. And there I was in the Data Research Center program, where I was, supporting researchers in not disclosing private information and using census data or, household surveys. And from there, step by step, I heard about UNESCO Institute for Statistics, and this was my first job in the education sector. And, really, I took the job. I was super excited to join UNESCO. I had been, dreaming of joining the UN for a while, but I didn't know if education was a good fit. So I tried. I gave myself a year to make sure that I could adapt to the sector and, learn what there was to learn. And this has been probably more than 10 years now already. So education came after data, but I think it's just a perfect mix.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I often teach about the statistics behind the census in some of my education classes, because it's just a really important public policy tool that might go kind of under the radar. You might not realize like how important that is for education and beyond. So yeah, that's wonderful to hear about. Maybe if we could jump to your current position. You're the senior program specialist, data and evidence in technical cooperation team at UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. So can you maybe tell our audience a little bit more about IIEP and your responsibilities and your position? What does kind of a day-to-day look like for you?
Yeah, so IIEP, as you said, is the institute, like the specialized institute of UNESCO for educational planning. And our role is really to support ministries of education and forecasting or anticipating the demand for education. So the number of students in the future, but also to kind of, prepare like the training of teachers, the recruitment and deployment of teachers, the printing of textbooks and so forth. And so everything that you need to do to manage a system actually is done by educational planners. And so we do have a training program that is really targeting ministry officials, development partners, stakeholders. We have research activities, always in collaboration with national research institutes and universities. And we have this technical cooperation program where I'm nested into, where we work shoulder to shoulder with ministry teams, with technical staff in ministries to do these models, to do these projections, and to do these reforms or, anything related to system management. And so in my little data and evidence team, what we do is really kind of have a micro planning lens, or a focus on planning that takes place at the sub-national level. So we would think about topics like middle management, workforce management at district or school level, school mapping, planning with geospatial data, the use of learning assessment data, education, data architectures, the use of evidence in planning. So it's kind of a really data-driven approaches to kind of feed into decision-making and, providing additional insights to planners and managers in the ministry. Typical day. I was thinking about last Friday. I think it was a very typical day for me. So I did a bit of administrative work, looking at contracts, making sure that the team was, confident and working through the work plan. Then I had a follow-up meeting with a country that is participating in a KIX EAP learning cycle. And then I did some focused work on data analysis to make some recommendations on education data in Togo. And then at the end of the day, I prepared an agenda for an upcoming meeting in Madagascar. So it's very diverse, never a dull minute, and very exciting work.
Yeah, that's wonderful. What a true global position where you sort of have connections and interactions globally. I love that, and what a fun position. I just can I jump in on something that you mentioned? You said you kind of helped to train people in these ministries to understand data and statistics. How difficult is that, or what does that kind of look like to explain that? Are they able to kind of to grasp some of these, the models and things like that?
Yeah, very good question. Actually, planners and managers in a Ministry of Education are sometimes, trained to do this work. But in many contexts, most of the planners are actually, people that were previously school principals that have been, teachers in the past. And so typically don't necessarily have been trained to be a planner or an education manager. And so although they do know very well the system, they know well the context, they don't necessarily have everything they need to actually perform very efficiently their tasks. And so this is where our programs get into, are mobilized to expand their capacities. There are national institutes or national training institutes that do provide courses in planning, but our role is really to kind of supplement these programs. And so when we talk about, data, statistics, indicators to people who've never been, collecting information or using information to make decisions, of course, that can be challenging. But what we try to do is really break down the program into pieces so that people can understand the vocabulary, the concepts, and even though they don't, become experts of education statistics, at least they can have a discussion with those who collect the data, with those who manage the data. And so in the end, even if they never do a calculation themselves, they will still be able to interpret indicators and, identify limitations and actually use them for, decision-making and potential impact.
Yeah, wow. That's important work, is sort of informing decision makers, on the information that they're receiving and getting. So that's wonderful. You're also involved with the KIX EAP Hub and the 2 learning cycles. So can you maybe talk a little bit about your work with our organization?
Absolutely. Well, IIEP and NORAG have been, partners for a long time. We've collaborated on different projects. We have ongoing activities together. And so we were kind of, natural partners for some of the KIX EAP activities. And so that's how the teams met with José Luis and the whole KIX EAP team. We worked together over the last 2 years, providing 2 different learning cycles. So one first learning cycle was on improving access to education using geospatial data. So that was really, using all these avalanche of geospatial information that is available online for free in most cases, using also a free open source software, QGIS, to actually work together with planners and the different participants of the KIX learning cycles to really get a hands-on experience in how to use education and statistics with geospatial data to find ways to really improve access to education. And so looking at the gaps and looking at the kind of spatial patterns. This year we have a new learning cycle. Together, we looked at diagnostic tools to improve the policies. And so basically it's building on a series of tools that have been developed by different agencies, different stakeholders in the education over the last decades, and trying to make a coherent historical and strategic analysis of these tools. And in the end, use a tool that we developed at IIEP that is relatively light, data light, and simple to use and quick to use to actually draw together a diagnosis of the education sector in the participating countries, especially looking at completion of education. And so these two learning cycles have been extremely interesting to implement, meeting a lot of teams from, I think, most of the KIX EAP participating countries, and also building this connection and this, interest for, always looking at the marginalized communities and looking at the exclusion patterns to see how we can really design better policies that really target communities and match their expectations.
Yeah, that I agree. Perfect partnership and doing some really wonderful and important work. Maybe let's turn to some of your research a little bit. You've recently published works on kind of natural hazards and risks for young people and educational facilities in particular. What are kind of natural hazards and what does that impact on the students? Are there best practices for mitigating that? And maybe if you have some examples, that would be maybe helpful.
Yeah, well, a natural hazard is basically an environmental event that has an actual potential to impact our human activities, opposed to a human hazard, like would be a conflict, for example. But not all natural events are actually a hazard. Not every hazard turn into a disaster. And so there's kind of this kind of chain of event and impact on human activities that make these natural circumstances dangerous to people and to education system in general. Yeah, our models, the models that we develop in the team, always kind of have this ambition of providing an extra layer of information, an extra layer of analysis to planners to make their decisions. I'm thinking of two models that we developed recently. The first one, for example, is overlapping the school map, so actual like maps on the territory, and school age population densities. And so we use this information to combine people and school system, that we combine then with the exposure to actual floods or avalanches or actual events that are extremely dangerous to the population. And so by doing this, what we can do with geospatial data and combining satellite imagery with the data from the education infrastructure is to actually see where people are affected, or where are the people exposed to these risks, where are the students, where are the schools. And so it allows the ministry to actually deploy the relief in a much more targeted way. We did this work in different contexts, but one paper that we published recently was taking the use case of Madagascar. There was a cyclone in February, and we turned to our colleagues at UNOSAT, who have this rapid emergency satellite program, where they actually identify or detect water on the land, and so they can identify areas that were flooded. So combining this information with the school map and the targeted school age populations for a different educational level, we could actually identify which were the schools that should be visited first to make sure that the infrastructure could stand, that not everything was damaged inside, and that the students that were living in the neighboring areas could actually be relocated temporarily to other schools to continue their education while the affected schools were cleaned up and put back into shape. so that's one way that we can use information from the school system, from geospatial data, and making sure that the education system is resilient, let's say, or responsive at least. The other tool that we developed that takes into account these natural hazards is actually one that supports the ministry to identify sites where they could actually build new schools in the safest place possible. Build new schools, of course, but also make sure that those that exist already can be maintained in a way that is appropriate to the context of the piece of land where they're built. In some countries, this type of analysis would not make sense because, it's perhaps very flat with not a lot of risks, not a lot of hazards. And so it wouldn't make sense to really have these very complex models. But where we tested this model was in one specific island in Indonesia, where there is volcanic risks, where there's tsunami risks, where there are different layers of environmental hazards that might affect the existing education system, the infrastructure, and also that we should be taking into account where we decide to build new schools. And so these are the types of models that we create. It's not to say that, the outputs of these models should be used as the holy truth and that, nothing else exists, but rather to give another piece of info to the ministry to tell them, well, if we look at nothing else than just the data, here what you could be finding interesting. But of course, it's not only data that regulates an education system or any system in general. So we hope to make a contribution this way.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I know my students have been really curious about some of the flooding that's happening, I think in Nigeria with schooling and people.
Mm-hmm,
yeah,
absolutely.
So that's really, it's such an important issue to try to work out. I'm kind of curious about some of the tools. Are you using sort of like GIS or R or these kinds of things, or is that
absolutely
on the right?
Actually,
okay.
One of the principles that we have in the team is that any of the tools, any of the algorithms, any of the plugin that we develop needs to be standing only on free open source software. Why? Because we want anyone in any ministry, in any university, to be able to replicate and to customize and to even improve for their own context. So we do provide kind of a basic architecture, a basic code for anyone to use. So it's all in open source, so anyone can actually download it from the GitHub repo or to just write to us and take the code from our publications. And then use it, because we publish also step-by-step guide. We provide, face-to-face or online trainings for using these tools. So we kind of provide everything that anyone would need to actually use the tool. But we do allow enough space with these different tools to be able, to be really connected to the realities of the context. So anyone can really customize it, but of course their own data, but actually change the variables, change the weights, and be able to really make sure that the tool works for them and not they work for the tool.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm so happy to hear, advocate of the, open source, open access. So that's wonderful to hear. What a resource for everyone out there. You've recently made comments on emergency distance learning. A lot of people had obviously to do this through COVID or potentially other types of disasters where you sort of maybe couldn't do in-person schooling. Can you maybe talk about the impacts or the effects on students and sort of what can we do to improve potential access in these spaces?
Yeah, it's true. I was recently interviewed on RFI, the Radio France Internationale, on a comment on promise of digital education and online learning for the future, for today, and also, as you said, we all had this kind of tentative experience during the COVID period, and basically what I'm saying, the message I'm trying to carry is that, of course, technology is part of the equation. No one can admit that technology is not part of the educational world. It is in planning processes, but it's also in the classroom. It's in the teacher room also. And so we have to take it into account, but we have to be careful. There's really not a lot of evidence that exists right now for us to really understand how children are learning or how teachers are teaching with full or partial digital support. And also some of the research from COVID are not, really convincing either. One of the first studies that I've read on the topic was analyzing the effect of distance learning in the Netherlands. And basically, the researchers were basically saying that Netherlands is the perfect use case, right? It's like a rich country with internet everywhere. Everybody has a cell phone, and so it was kind of the perfect ecosystem to test or to use digital learning, distance learning for the COVID. And basically, the results were kind of disappointing. There was not really there was not at all, I believe, any additional learning being done. Even the researchers could identify a loss of learning in spite of being in the perfect context to have the digital learning. So we have to be careful. But I do think indeed that we have also the responsibility to provide students in a country, or if I put myself in the shoes of a planner, we have a responsibility to provide educational opportunities to everyone, especially when there are school closures. And so we have to make sure that the distance education opportunities that we provide are really fit for context. And so it means analyzing not only education system data, but data from the radio, TV providers, the cellular data providers, internet providers, to really identify which type of distance learning would work better in which district. In some district might be pen and paper, for sure. In the capital might be online platforms. Now, the question is, where would which system work best? And also how to make sure that the type of education or the quality of the education, the distance education that students are getting district to district is consistent. And so that we provide the same type of quality to everyone. So these are really, I think, post-COVID discussions. We're tracking or, tracing all the research on these topics. We're connecting also with colleagues from sibling agencies at ITU or other organizations that work in these spaces. And we try to really push further the discussion on distance learning strategies to make sure that they're relevant and fit for context.
Right. So, I mean, again, another crucial exploration as we move forward and kind of look backwards and say what happened when we had to have this Band-Aid over the past couple of years and just kind of flip things on a dime. And I worry about it myself, especially we see a lot of inequalities of, somebody, maybe they had a space to do the class on, or a good internet signal, and someone else didn't, and so how do we sort of make something more equitable when previously this was sort of a public good, education, or at least the idea of public education, and you're suddenly making it into a private thing that happens in a home? That's really difficult.
Absolutely. And during the last few years, I've been, tracking down, examples of how communities organize themselves to provide educational services. And I think that there's a lot of, creativity and a lot of strategies that we don't really think of as planners in a capital, in a country. But when you look at all these teachers that were, going home to home on their bicycle with all their resources in the back, or when you hear about, the radio programs in Togo, and, there are plenty of examples that really show that the best strategies are those that are thought about by the communities themselves. In microplanning, we always say local constraints, local solutions. And so that's why the dialogue with the communities is so important when we're a planner, that we really have to listen to the communities and make sure that we give, the support of the ministry to these initiatives to make sure that the solutions really, mean something for the people.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And we try to do that on the podcast too, bringing on guests and people like that are on the ground. And, especially teachers, my mom was a teacher, so I have a soft spot for for local educators. And it's just been so hard for them the past couple of years in pretty much sectors across the world, and, trying to listen to them and raise their voice. So yeah, I definitely endorse that comment. So thank you. We're kind of coming to the end of the interview. It's been fun, but I have kind of a big question for you. So we'll see how long this final question goes. But, there's this sort of stereotype of people kind of freezing up when they see numbers and stats. Obviously, some of this related to kind of socializations and maybe how we kind of teach mathematics and numbers and stats. Do you have any thoughts on how we can sort of, open up the space and cast a wider net, and maybe some advice for young people that are thinking about, demography or similar types of careers, and maybe even like at a place like UNESCO?
Yeah, it's true that some people do freeze up when they see numbers or, hear about numbers. I think that the reality is that people are not so much afraid of the numbers, but they are afraid of their perspective not being heard. Same for the opposite, right? Some geeks like me are just, freezing up when they hear about qualitative research or, interviews or focus group. But the reality is that we absolutely need to merge these perspectives. We need to combine sources of evidence. We need to hear everybody's voice. And I said in the beginning, I came from my national statistical office. I work at UNESCO Institute for Statistics for 7 years. I came to IIEP with a very data set mind, very square mind. And initially, getting in the world of educational planning, I was really amazed at how qualitative things were, how political processes were. And so I really needed to learn to kind of not let go of my data skills or my data interest, but actually embrace the kind of other side. And I think that this is something I did for myself, but this is something I also try to kind of share with others, that it's really not about one method being better than the other one. It's about combining methods. In a discussion we also had at NORAG in the context of the KIX EAP program, we discussed the use of evidence. And we know, basically, the point I try to make is that we really need to shift from evidence-based decision-making to evidence-informed decision-making. And not only that is already changing the perspective, but also we need to kind of embrace a wider definition of what is evidence. And so evidence can be surveys, can be census, but can be also, focus groups, can be interviews with parents and teachers, and can also be, observation, can be the experience of the elders, can be experience of the teacher. And so we need to find ways to combine all these perspectives. So that being said, I think that being more humble about our expertise is always a good strategy. And I think that disciplines like demography, of course, these are the best disciplines because they really combine the numbers, the analytical perspectives with the kind of human social impacts, social dynamics. And so this is what really motivated me to pursue my studies in demography, and also kind of argue for people to do that type of studies. But similar career paths would be absolutely fulfilling. Any type of data-driven analysis can be useful in the education sector, as long as we don't, as long as we kind of don't keep our nose too close to the data, and remember that basically behind these data there are students and people. So that's kind of the perspective.
Sure. What a wonderful message for everyone, and I definitely co-sign on sort of interdisciplinary and mixing the different quant and qual and bringing them all together in the same room. So Amélie, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful interview, and we can't wait to see more work from your office. So thank you.
Thanks to you.
And this concludes our KIX EAP podcast, which is released every first Wednesday of the month. Of course, the opinions expressed on the KIX EAP podcast are solely those of the host and the guest. The KIX EAP podcast is made possible by KIX, which stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. KIX is an initiative of the Global Partnership for Education. Globally, KIX is administered by the International Development Research Center in Canada. NORAG in Geneva hosts one of the 4 regional hubs of KIX. Find us on the NORAG or GPE KIX websites. You can subscribe to the KIX EAP podcast, newsletter, and webinar series, and also learn about KIX global or regional projects. Additionally, you can subscribe directly on Spotify or SoundCloud to receive notifications of the new monthly podcast. Find us on the NORAG or GPE KIX websites. You can subscribe to the KIX EAP podcast, newsletter, and webinar series, and also learn about KIX global or regional projects. Additionally, you can subscribe directly on Spotify or SoundCloud to receive notifications of the new monthly podcast. Thanks for listening.